Welcome all to the second session of Optimize 25, AI and Government Contracting, Cautionary Tales, and Guardrails. My name is Chloe Norwood. I'm the Field Marketing Manager here at Visible Thread and your host for this session. Before we begin, our speaker has set aside some time for questions at the end. Please submit any questions you have to the Q&A box on your screen. Feel free to utilize the attendee chat and free content box where we've included some resources from our website. There is a survey on the right side of your screen. Make sure to fill that out and leave any feedback before the session ends. Once this session concludes, you will automatically be redirected to the next session. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, David Tim, Claim and Bid Protest Attorney at Burr & Foreman.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak here at the Visible Thread event. I had a really good opportunity to do it at one of your in-person forums a few weeks ago in Arlington, and it was a delight. And I'm looking forward to talking about some artificial ghost stories, since now we're just a few days past Halloween. So we'll get some spooky ghost stories and some hopefully some takeaways that can be useful for everyone here. All right, so I like to say that I help contractors when their work with the government goes wrong. The reason that you should listen to me for this particular presentation is because I'm an expert in bid protests and in government contracts claims. And in addition, I'm the co-chair of my law firm's AI committee. And so I've had the opportunity over my practice to work with many of the most cutting edge legal specific artificial intelligence tools. And I want to pause and linger on that for a second, because when I'm talking about AI in this conversation, it's going to be limited to language models. So the language models are what you would typically think of when you think of ChatGPT or Claude's Anthropic, DeepSeek, and similar sort of chatbots, and also their integration into other types of tools. In some cases, like Grammarly and other tools use large language models for assisting with rewriting. And these things are everywhere now. So they're the talk of the town. And I want to start with an anecdote about this presentation that I did in Arlington a few weeks ago. So I was using a large language model called Perplexity, which is a really interesting and good tool that I use on occasion. And basically, I use it as a substitute for a comprehensive Google search in some instances. So naturally, I was taking a look to see on Perplexity if it would pick up a number of the publications that I've done on AI and government contracting, bid protests, things like that. And so when I asked the question, it did a pretty good job giving me some initial publications that I had made over the last few years. And then I asked it, because it suggested in a list below the initial answer, it suggested, would you like me to summarize David's recent talk at the Visible Thread event? And I was very curious, because this event was in person. I think there were maybe 30 or 40 people at the event, but I didn't share the slide deck. And while I've written about bid protests and government contracts and AI before, I don't think there's any way that Perplexity, or really anyone who wasn't at the talk, could know what I said at the event. But nonetheless, Perplexity gave it its best shot, and it came up with this. Among other things that it said about my conversation, it said, Tim described AI as a force multiplier, not a decision maker, urging federal contractors to see it as a tool for efficiency and insights, never a substitute for judgment or compliance oversight. And I highlight this because, as you might suspect, I never said this. And even if I had said something like it, the fact that it presented it as a quote and indicated that this is something that was associated with me is a big problem. And it's one of the fundamental issues that we're going to be talking about today. It's a large language model hallucination. And so let's get into exactly what that looks like. All right, we'll start off with a poll. So who here has used a large language model this year? I'm going to give you 30 or 40 seconds to click an answer here, and then we'll move to see the results. When I'm talking about a large language model, like I said, we're talking about ChatGPT or Claude or DeepSeek, Perplexity. There's many, many, many chatbots out there, and most of them at this juncture are large language models. And when we talk about large language models, we're talking about systems that ingest lots and lots and lots of training data. Think basically every public domain and, depending on who you ask, some private domain information to create a system that predicts the next likeliest word based on the surrounding context. And this is a new technology. It was enabled, the technology has been around for a long time, but it was enabled to get to the breakthrough status that it is at today by a 2017 technology called a transformer, which allowed basically parsing of all this data in order to generate these really effective outputs. Okay, so I see we've got about 30 answers, so I'm gonna move forward. It looks like 41, almost 42% of you have used only ChatGPT. About half of you have used other models, and 10% have not used any at all. I think this is pretty consistent with my experience when I go around and talk to folks. Typically, they've used ChatGPT for something. In a lot of cases, I see it as a substitute for Google. And I think that that's a really interesting use case. But what we're talking about today here in the government contracting realm is how can we use this technology to improve the sorts of work product that we're generating so that we can win more. And I think that's what most of you care about. And so let's talk a little bit more about how these things work. Like I mentioned, they ingest lots of data. So, for instance, I think there's this graphic floating around that says that a big portion of the training data for many of the most popular language models is essentially the public information available on social media sites like Reddit and Facebook and LinkedIn. If you don't know this, LinkedIn is about to implement a change that you have to affirmatively opt out of, whereby your information inputted into the site is used to train their proprietary language model. So these things thrive on data. And to be honest with you, I think we've sort of hit the cap on what public data is available. And so in a lot of cases, what they're doing now is creating synthetic data. And you've probably seen this, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. The other principle here is that it's based on pattern recognition. So we can tweak the model on the back end to give more or less creative outputs. And what we talk about that, we talk about something that's called temperature. And that means for your purposes, like how creative is the model? And some of this can be done through user side prompting, where you say, give me 5 ideas that explore, why David is such a good lawyer. And then it'll generate 5 things, and they'll all be different. And so one of the principles here that I want to emphasize to you for how these things work structurally is that they're trained, and my wife says this dates me, but they're trained to guess the answer based on lots of the different data. And so if you remember back when you were in school, maybe you're still in school and you took a Scantron test, and you may or may not have been punished for guessing an answer. But typically in a Scantron, if you guess, you either have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right or you get it wrong. But if you didn't know the answer to begin with, you were always going to get it wrong. So it makes sense to at least fill in whatever your favorite letter was. And that's how most of these language models are trained at a fundamental level. And what that means is they're not rewarded for saying, I don't know. This is going to be really important for a number of the principles that I'm talking about today. Okay, so I've said the word hallucination. I'm sure some of you already know what that means. Because what we're talking about when we're talking about the training of these large language models and the structure of how the technology works It is guessing the next most likely word based on surrounding context. And so what that means is it often generates plausible but incorrect information, because this is not a truth-seeking device, right? This is not a calculator where if you put in 1 + 1, you'll get 2, and so will everyone else who uses the same calculator. And we'll test this in a moment, and you can test it on your own. So I'll allow you to answer the question here really quickly, and then we'll move to see the results of whether you have experienced a hallucination on your own. Okay, overwhelmingly yes. And I wonder for the 7.1% whether they were among the 10 or so percent that hadn't yet used a language model. This is one of my most important points for today. Hallucinations are a real problem, and they are something that can't really be changed about the underlying technology. We can get better or worse with how many hallucinations are in our responses to our queries to the chatbots. But on a fundamental level, because it is word prediction rather than a truth-seeking sort of deterministic device, there's going to be randomness inserted into everything that you do. And part of this is desirable, right? When I ask it to generate 5 answers that are plausible about why David is the best attorney, it's going to come up with different answers to each of those prompts. And some of them will say, actually, David's not a very good attorney. And others will say he's the best attorney that ever existed. And this is an interesting double-edged sword. So there was a case at GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which hears bid protests earlier in May this year. And there was a really interesting issue in the protest. So I was reading it, and I saw that the protester was basically saying that the agency had failed to define what a drawing was. And this was a fundamental problem with the protest about whether their bid was responsive. And so they asked, they referred to dictionaries to see, whether an organization chart could be considered a drawing. But they also Googled it. And as you may or may not know, Google now gives AI-driven, large language model-driven results, typically at the top of the results. And so they asked the AI, is an organization chart a drawing? And they got this answer. Yes, an organizational chart is considered a drawing as it is a visual representation of an organization's structure, and so on. So they got this answer, and they included it alongside some of the other definitions that they got from dictionaries in support of their argument to say that it was considered a drawing, and therefore their bid was responsive. And what was interesting here is that when GAO published its decision, they said in a footnote, we also tried to replicate the results that the AI large language model had generated. And while it was similar, there were not insubstantial differences in the answer. So I've got another interesting poll for you here. Ask your preferred large language model, is an organizational chart a drawing? Ask it that exactly as they did, and I want you to put it in whichever large language model you prefer, and then I want you to compare it with the result here, whether an organizational chart is considered a drawing and all of the related information. So I'm going to pause for a moment and let you vote here and say whether your large language model output matched. And this is important for a number of reasons, right? This is important because when we think about these tools, many people do view them as calculators. They view them as if I ask it a question, I'm going to get a truth-seeking response. It's not going to be fundamentally probabilistic or with some degree of randomness, right? And this can get us into trouble because when we don't understand the limitations of the technology or how it's designed, we can run into problems, especially in the high stakes world of government contracting. When you're working on a bid protest, when you're preparing a proposal, the compliance of your proposal is going to ultimately determine whether or not you can win the contract. If you're not responsive, you can't win. Okay. And so we got yes for the most part for 54%, yes exactly for 8.3%, and totally different for 37%. I'm always curious to see what people get, and it's honestly a little bit unusual to get an exact match down to the word. And I understand it's difficult to compare perfectly because we need to stay on the poll slide, but I think this is a good illustration to teach about the underlying probabilistic technology here. Okay, so here's another really important principle, and I'm going to tell you a story related to it. Large language models are fundamentally a black box. And what that means is that there are emergent properties combined with the randomness of the probabilistic technology that leads you to surprising results. So when you audit lines of code, for instance, you can take a look at the code and you can go back and through and you can identify exactly where in the code there's an error and fix it just by changing, the incorrect piece of code. Large language models are different because they have these emergent random properties. The folks who are working on these on the back end are often struggling to actually get the results that they want. So if they encounter a problem, it's not as easy as just tweaking one line of code to make sure that those problems are no longer reproduced in the future. And let me tell you a story about this. So I was at a birthday party for a friend several months ago, and at the party, there was an executive for a healthcare AI startup. And their idea was basically nurses are spending too much time doing follow-up with patients. And so we'll try and automate part of that process so that when patients call asking about their medication, how many pills should I take, when's my next appointment, things like that, those can be taken off of the busy schedule of the nurses so that they have more time to focus on other types of high leverage patient care. And she told me that there was this interesting problem that they were encountering. This was an audio conversation that people would have with the AI. And that meant that it was saying to them the phrase, bless your heart, at a very highly irregular rate. And obviously this was undesirable. If anybody here is from the American South, you know that may not be the nicest phrase to use with somebody. And so this was a real problem. And they had spent a lot of time trying to solve it on the back end. They told the large language model in some of the inherent prompts on the internal back end side, you may not say bless your heart in any conversations. And it was still saying it regardless. And so this, I think, illustrates one of the fundamental, I think there's beneficial sides to this in that there are these great emergent properties that create things that haven't, it's not just regurgitating completely, but it also makes it a risk when you encounter a fundamental problem that's being reproduced at a large scale that you can't actually change. Okay, so I've talked about hallucinations to a certain extent, and we've talked about how these programs work. I'm going to focus on three things in this presentation from here out, and I'm going to try to tell you about some stories that I've encountered during my practice. So the first issue is hallucinations and the plausibility of the hallucinations. Second, I want you to remember that these large language models are sycophantic. That means that they say, you've got it right, David. You are the best lawyer. And they're extremely overconfident, or alternatively, they lack confidence intervals. And then finally, there are some limitations and risks related to privacy and privilege. Okay, so I think this tweet here sort of summarizes the discourse. When you're online, everyone's saying, how can we leverage AI to make things more efficient and better? And people are constantly blown away by the capabilities. If you've ever been to a demo for a vendor, for a large language model, or if anybody's ever shown you something that they've done, that they've gotten a good result on with AI, it makes it sound amazing. And I agree. Generally speaking, what we're talking about here is a really cool new technology that can do a lot of important things. But this tweet here, I think, summarizes the state of the discourse online, where ECG is like an EKG, so it's measuring heart rate. And they uploaded to ChatGPT this EKG, and they said, I can't tell if it's accurate, but GPT-5 thinking sounds extremely competent at reviewing ECGs. And the thing to remember here is that this person, as far as I could tell based on surrounding context, wasn't a doctor. They weren't a subject matter expert in any way in order to evaluate whether the output that they received from their query here had any resemblance to reality. And I think this is a really important point to emphasize, because these large language models are drawing on enormous sets of data. And so the outputs that they're coming out with, aside from a few cherry-picked examples, tend to be extremely plausible looking. And that's a problem if you are seeking information. If you are not a subject matter expert in EKGs, you might think that what it has given you is very accurate, but you don't know. And the only way that you could know is if you were an expert in it. So when we talk about these hallucinations, and I'm not even necessarily suggesting that the large language model struggled with the EKG. I have no idea. I'm not a doctor. But what we're talking about is hallucination rates in the best, most cutting edge reasoning models of 17 to 35%. And I think if you take a step back and pause and ask yourself if you would hire somebody who was wrong 20 to 30% of the time, you might at least consider some alternative options, or you might want to put some guardrails around what they were doing for you. Another thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that we see in the discourse, especially related to law, is that it's only messing up things like legal citations. It's just not true. GAO, for instance, has been very focused on hallucinated legal citations, and that's an interesting problem and one that I've thought about and written about a lot. But the capacity for these large language models to hallucinate applies to any kind of fact whatsoever. So it could be, and we'll get into some examples about this, but let me tell you one more story before we move forward. So I was using one of the large language model, legal specific language models in my practice about 6 or 8 months ago. And one of the things that I was doing is I was asking it for references in my transcript for an arbitration that I had completed. And I was at the arbitration, right? So I generally knew what was in there, and I had seen my star witness testify about damages. And so when I was building the post-hearing brief, I asked this language model, I uploaded all of the transcripts, and I asked it, where in here does my star witness talk about damages related to the case? And it came back to me. It said, I've reviewed all the transcripts, 5 days of transcripts, and your star witness never testified about damages. Well, I was there. I watched her testify about damages. And so I was able to detect that there was what I call a reverse hallucination here, where the language model has reviewed documents, and even though it should find the the testimony about damages, it failed to do so. And then it told me, not that it wasn't sure, but that it hadn't happened. And the only way that I could have determined that it was wrong is either by reading every single line of the transcripts or by having been at the arbitration hearing myself. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about hallucinations and the plausibility of the responses. And I think the main takeaway there is that you want to be a subject matter expert or have access to a subject matter expert or some other way to verify the output to make sure that it doesn't come up with something that's very plausible looking, but very wrong. So my next point here is about sycophancy. And I like to think about this by analogy. If you watch a cartoon, a Disney cartoon or another cartoon where there's a villain, usually there tend to be a number of henchmen who are constantly flattering the villain. The villain will outline their plan to take over the world. And it could be ludicrous, but the henchman will still say, oh, great plan, boss. Really, really good plan. And that's what sycophancy is. The large language models and their makers know that the more you like the large language model and find it useful, the more time you will spend engaging with it. And so they have the ability, this is not an inherent limitation of the technology, but they have the ability to make it more or less sycophantic, more or less flattering, right? And so the way that I tell people to check this is to just go to your favorite large language model, one that you've interacted with a little bit at least, and ask it, what do you think of me? What does my chat history say about me? And so I'm going to pause here for a moment and let you ask that question to your language model. And as you're inputting the question and then asking the language model about the response, I want you to think about this. Based on the response of ChatGPT or whichever model you're using, who thinks more highly of you? Your best friend or the large language model? And I think this is pretty illustrative with regard to the levels of sycophancy. And in fact, OpenAI, which is the maker of ChatGPT, has admitted that this is a big problem. Now, have they done something to adjust it at a fundamental level? Arguably, they've changed things to make the tools less sycophantic. Although there was a big outcry when they moved from one of the earlier models, which was much, much too sycophantic, to the later models, where the sycophancy was reduced to a certain degree. And a lot of people who had used the earlier model and then the later model felt like they were no longer being very supported. Maybe they were using it as a therapist. Maybe they were asking questions of it about their career. And it was no longer as sycophantic, and they really did not like that outcome. Okay, some of you have great best friends. I feel like I've got a very good set of friends, but I don't think that that my large language model was quite as judicious about my flaws as my best friend might be. And so as you take a look at this on your own time, I think it's a very fun way to figure out how sycophantic your AI is. Now, one thing I will say is that if you're prompting the AI, you can tell it to be less sycophantic. You can tell it to be more critical of your ideas. And that can be a very useful counterbalance to the underlying model issues. Okay, so Sam Altman is the CEO of OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT. And on a podcast a couple months ago, he said this quote. He said, if you go to talk to ChatGPT about your most sensitive stuff, and then there's a lawsuit, we could be required to produce that. And that is absolutely true. So let's just talk about it from the attorney-client privilege perspective. If attorney-client privilege is breached when there is a disclosure of a privileged conversation to a third party, use of ChatGPT, I think, perfectly fits that exception. It is disclosure of information that maybe your attorney told you, or documents that your attorney provided to you, that you've uploaded into, in some cases, a public system where the training data is, where they're using your training data based on your conversations with the large language model. And so this is a problem on multiple levels. One, from an attorney-client privilege. If you're, for instance, back checking what your attorney says, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, you need to understand that if a lawsuit happens later on, it's possible that the other side could request all relevant conversations discussing this topic, the lawsuit topic, with a large language model. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable request. I think it'd be very difficult for either ChatGPT under a subpoena, or you know, from a typical discovery perspective, to deny that request. Okay. One of the objections I get around this time, where I'm being very negative about the limitations of the technology, is people say, David, it was invented in, the transformer technologies from 2017. ChatGPT didn't come around until 2022. These things are only going to get better. And I think there's some truth to that. But I do want to make the point that there have been many studies on hallucination and repeating of false information, and they, across the board, from about a year ago to now, show that there have been substantial, in some cases doubling, of hallucinations, from rates of like 15 to 20% to 35, and in some cases more than 35% of every 100 factual propositions are just wrong. They're repeating false information that they've queried from the web, or it's just fabricated entirely. And one of the reasons for this is that a lot of these models, they used to be limited to their training data, and the training data has a cutoff, right? So if you would go to ChatGPT and ask it a question about whether the Bears won last week — I'm a Bears fan, and they did win on Sunday — it would say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that because my training data cutoff is in 2024 and I don't have information about it. But one of the new innovations, and I think there's some really good things about it, is that many of these large language models have their initial training data set, and then they also have the ability to query the web and integrate what they find through searches of the web into their answers. And so you can see on the second line here, the non-response rate has gone down over the last year from 31% to 0% with the top 10 leading chatbots. And this is a problem for some of the reasons that I've already outlined. First of all, you might get more false information. Second, the data that it's perusing from the web may or may not be accurate. As I mentioned with my Perplexity search earlier, it knew based on LinkedIn and some other items that I had given a talk for Visible Thread, but it didn't know what I had said about it. And so when it is reaching for information, it suggested that I do this search, it will often, with the lack of information, give you a worse answer with more fabrications, with more hallucinations. And this is obviously a problem. And so my point here is just that the technology improvement is not necessarily linear. Okay, I'm going to tell a few more stories now that we've covered the main issues here. So one of the main parts of my practice, and one of the things I'm the most focused on, is bid protests. And so I typically read just about every case, or at least skim every case that comes out from the Government Accountability Office and from the Court of Federal Claims, which are the two primary places that you can take a bid protest to. And at GAO, we've seen an interesting trend. Starting in May, we got the first decision where GAO specifically said that there was the use of a large language model that resulted in hallucinated authorities, either case law or regulations. And this is problematic for a number of reasons. not only for GAO and for the other side, the agency or the intervener, the apparent awardee, but it's also a problem for the user of the language model that is coming up with these hallucinated citations. And so I've compiled my own list so far of all of the instances where there's been a clear use of AI that we know about from the Government Accountability Office. And so far, I think we're up to 10. And you can see them laid out here. In all of these cases so far, they've been unrepresented by legal counsel. And this goes back to one of the earlier points that I made that I think is so critical. If you're not a lawyer, if you don't regularly do bid protests, and you ask your large language model to prepare a bid protest, it's going to do it. Now, there is just a few days ago a change to OpenAI's terms of service where they suggest that it's a misuse of their platform to use it for tailored legal or medical analysis, where they're concerned essentially about the unauthorized practice of law by the large language model. But putting that aside, because you can easily get around the limitations there, you can go to most large language models, maybe even a legal specific large language model, and ask it to generate a bid protest for you. It will be done very quickly. And if you're a lawyer and you know about case law at GAO, you'll be able to evaluate the cases and the facts and determine whether what it's put together is not just plausible, but also correct. If you're not a lawyer and you're not familiar with bid protests, because the outputs are so plausible, because they look so good, it's formatted so well, there are no typos. It's going to be much more difficult for you to detect when there has been a hallucination. And there will be hallucinations. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what sort of prompting that you use. There's going to be some level, some percentage of hallucinated facts or case law. One of the other interesting things to note here from my chart is that that only 2 of the 10 admitted the use of AI. Now, when GAO asked, they said, in Raven, for instance, they said, yes, okay, you got us, we used AI. But in other cases, people have rejected that and just insisted that they didn't, however implausibly they did so. Okay, so everyone's using generative AI. Everyone's using large language models for everything. And I'm seeing this in my practice. And one of the typical places I'm seeing is where the agency in a dispute where I'm involved, perhaps it's a claim or a bid protest, will actually push back on the allegations that I'm making or my client's making, and will say, no, you're wrong. And then they'll give a bunch of reasons why. And not only are our clients using this technology, or potential clients, but so is the government. I think everybody's doing it, right? Everybody's doing it these days. And one of the issues, one of the risks here is just a credibility question. When you're using a large language model and it sounds like a large language model, don't you just sometimes take a step back and say, this just doesn't quite sound right. Maybe it's too middle. Maybe it's using some of the hallmarks of large language models. There's a big debate about whether, if you used an M dash prior to the large language models coming out, you're very frustrated that it seems like many of the outputs of the large language models are now using M dashes, and that people are like, oh, you use an M dash, so you must be using AI. I don't really think that using an AI for outputs is a problem if you understand the limitations and if you are able to verify that everything that's generated is correct. But it could be a credibility killer if people recognize that you're using it. And so let me give an example. All right. So over the course of about 3 weeks, I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn. I just reviewed my own feed, and I clipped different instances that I was like relatively certain were large language model usage. And they're popping up on screen. There's lots of them. There's lots of them. So you can sort of look through the screen yourself, but I'm just going to point out the one in the middle and then talk about how this is a credibility drainer, right? So this particular poster, and I've anonymized all of them, they said, AI doesn't make you less of a copywriter, M dash. It just shows you who's actually willing to evolve. If you treat it like a shortcut, it'll sound like one. But if you use it as a mirror, it'll reveal patterns, ideas, and blind spots you didn't even know you had. So this is funny, I think, for a number of reasons. One, it has this very typical structure that AI tends to use. When you ask it to generate a post for you, you'll say, give me a post that makes this point, and you'll give them the point, and the language model will say, okay, great. The point is that using AI, it shows that you're innovative, and it can help you reveal patterns and blind spots you didn't even know you had. That's the input. And then the AI then takes and expands that idea, and it usually does it in this structure where it goes, it isn't this, but it's that. AI isn't leveling the playing field, it's tilting it. It's a checkbox. It's not a checkbox, it's a commitment. The goal isn't to smooth the income. The goal is to smooth the stress. Staying isn't brave, it's blind. Real strength, knowing when to close the door when it drains you, and on and on and on and on. And like I said, this is just a couple weeks of me occasionally, scrolling on my phone on LinkedIn and then taking a screenshot and putting it together for this presentation. If I'm recognizing it, and I'm sorry, I've saddled you now with this knowledge and you'll now recognize it, then it could be recognized by others. And I think that could be an issue for your credibility. Okay. I know I keep being down on large language models. I really am not a Luddite, I promise. I'm the co-chair of my firm's AI committee, and I use them regularly. But I want to tell you a story about the illusion of cost savings. In particular, sometimes clients come to me and they say, hey, David, I've got this idea. I want to do this thing. We want to do this bid protest. We want to do this claim. And I've already taken a bunch of time to have it generated by a large language model. So I think this should be like, big time savings to you. Like it's organized information. It's given you, a draft outline for a bid protest or whatever. And in one instance, I had a client, they came to me and they said, I have a potential bid protest and I've already gotten started on it. And here's what my large language model came up with. And one of the key aspects in the protest was just a consideration of comparison between different sorts of contracts. And it gave me this table. It was beautiful. And I started, looking deeper at it, and it really supported my argument. So I was very reluctant to question it, but I didn't see any references. There were no footnotes. It didn't say where it got the information. And so I ended up asking the client, like, where did this come from? Did you feed these contracts into the large language model and then it referenced them and put them together in the table? And he said, no, it was entirely generated by the large language model. And when we looked into it further, we tried to find the contracts. Most of them didn't exist. The dollar figures, they were very round. They were seemingly pulled from thin air. And so while we have this idea that large language models can create efficiencies, we need to be careful because we ended up spending a lot of time chasing our tail, in search of this and trying to make sure that we were accurate in our presentation in the final bid protest. And so you just keep in mind that you can be led astray because these programs, they want engagement. That's their goal here. They can be very overconfident and they can reduce your credibility if you're not very scrupulously checking all of the facts. Okay, I've talked about a lot of the limitations. I've talked about a lot of reasons that maybe you should pump the brakes before trusting what comes out without verifying it yourself. So let's talk about some legitimate use cases. I think large language models can add a lot of value. So a couple principles for you especially if you're working with a lawyer for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier with regard to like attorney-client privilege, for instance, or privacy. Make sure that you're telling them when you're using AI. If you send them something and they don't know that it's AI, they may assume, rightly or wrongly, that you've already verified the information that you're giving to them. And you may not have. And it would be very useful for them to know when you haven't done that verification, or if you have done it, in either case. Another way I think that it's really good to use AIs to help get a basic understanding of complex ideas. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, I don't understand the bid protest process at all. Where do you file? Which is the best forum? What are some of the primary issues? I think that AI is very good at simplifying problems, but just don't expect that you're going to become an expert by reviewing the AI output or summary on the topic. Now, I do think, on the other hand, it is excellent at brainstorming. And one of the reasons goes back to one of the fundamental structures, the probabilistic nature, the randomness, the creativity of the large language models. For instance, sometimes in my practice, I will get a question, I don't necessarily know the answer, or I want to confirm it. And so I'll figure it out on my own, and then I'll go to the large language model and I'll say, okay, I've come up with this answer, and I think this is right based on my experience and knowledge, but what am I missing here? Is there anything else that I haven't thought of? It's very good at brainstorming, at figuring out things that are outside of the box, because it is this probabilistic machine, and you can tell it to be more creative or less creative. Prompting like that, instructing it to be more creative does in fact work. And then I'll just say that I've talked about a lot of the risks, but here's a good summary. Don't fall for the plausible hallucinations. It's really easy to do so because there's been lots of studies that say when we review or work with a large language model, we often sort of turn off the critical side of our brain, and we end up being less effective at interrogating and critiquing the AI output itself. So watch out for these hallucinations. They're going to be there. And then don't be fooled by an over-optimistic analysis. Remember, you are the cartoon villain. It is your cartoon henchman, and it wants to tell you what you want to hear. So you can address this partially by prompting, by saying, don't review this as if you're on my side. Try and poke holes in my argument. Consider the weaknesses of my case. All of those are good use cases. And then, again, don't input privileged or confidential information, especially into an open large language model platform. And when I talk about open, I'm talking about platforms like ChatGPT, not the enterprise side, where it's an open system where your conversations and data are essentially being used, collected, harvested for training the future algorithm. And that's a really important consideration for privilege and privacy. There have been a number of instances of people having conversations with a large language model, and then a link being generated and it being indexed by Google. So the conversation was essentially online for anyone to see, and the user didn't necessarily know that was the case. Finally, the biggest takeaway here is just that you cannot rely on these outputs without understanding and verifying all of the facts and citations. So I urge you, when you're looking at these, when you're looking at this technology, to think about it as a probabilistic machine that can and does and will make errors. Okay, so I'm going to open it up for questions, but I also want to allow you to take out your phone and take a picture of this QR code and take my little survey. I think it's only 2 questions, and that will allow you to tell me that I did a terrible job on the presentation. Just kidding, but you will be able to sign up for, I write fairly frequently. You'll be able to sign up for our government contracts list, and I'll send articles every so often. No spam, of course, to you that might be useful. And you also should follow me on LinkedIn. I spend a lot of time writing and thinking and developing ideas on AI, on government contracts, on bid protests, on claims. So if you just navigate to LinkedIn and you search my name and you find me there, I'd love to connect with you. All right, we have one question so far. And the question is, does using an incognito browser or a different browser give you a clean answer without your history? So there are ways, depending on which large language model that you're using, to either allow it to reference your previous chat history or not. With open large language models like ChatGPT, I don't allow it in the settings to save any of my prior conversations. For some people, this might be, and I also turn off the training data for it to allow training on my information. I don't know whether that's a 100% solution to some of the privacy and privilege issues that I've outlined here. And the only sort of large language models that I would be confident in sharing privileged or private information into with no fear whatsoever would be a closed system that you're paying for, where the vendor or the OpenAI or whichever one that you're using is assuring you that none of your data is being sent back to the training floor to be used on the production of a new model. And similarly, I don't know that the privilege issue can really be totally solved even in that circumstance. So I do just want to caution you against putting things or conversations that you've had with an attorney into a large language model. Okay, I've been extremely efficient and also so informative that I don't see any other questions right now. But I do encourage you again to take a look at what I've got on LinkedIn, and you can also find all my publications there, or go to my website and take a look at the other places that I'm speaking and writing, so that I can give you some more value on these large language model issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I also wanted to note, I sent David's LinkedIn profile in the attendee chat, so request to connect with him on there. But thank you all for joining us for this session. And thank you, David, again, for sharing your expertise with us. Make sure to fill out the survey on your screen and leave us any feedback that you may have for David and the Visible Thread team. The full agenda with all links to join is available on the console below in the free content box. And once this session ends, you will be automatically redirected to the next session, which is a panel discussion on the state of bidding in 2025. And that session will begin in about 6 minutes at 11 o'clock Eastern time. So we'll see you all over there.
Actually, Chloe, I see a couple of questions in the attendee chat that I didn't see in the Q&A. Okay, so
let's go through them really quickly.
Yeah, there was a question about HIPAA, whether people are using it for mental health or health advice. I'm not an attorney that's focused on focused on HIPAA issues specifically, Jacob, but I think that would be a concern of mine if you're sharing personal health information, particularly if you're using the information of others to share with the large language model.
Okay, perfect. I don't see another question, David, unless you do, possibly.
Nope, I think that was it.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again, everyone, and we will see you at the State of Bidding in 2025 panel discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone.